then again, who defines what's disinformation? This is, I could give you numerous examples where governments have been putting out stuff during COVID, for example, which was disinformation.
Yeah, that's
right?
true.
So again, this becomes this very slippery slope about who decides. And therefore, for me, the only guarantee in all of this has got to be public opinion, has got to be public debate.
Hello, I'm John O'Brien. I'm Head of Communications at MCC Brussels. You're familiar with the Deep Dive series. This is where we take a more in-depth look at the research and reports produced by MCC Brussels. I'm really happy today to be joined by Dr. Norman Lewis. Norman has written a new report. It's just been released. Manufacturing Misinformation, the EU-funded propaganda war against free speech. And that's what we're going to talk to Norman about today. Norman, what prompted you to go off and begin digging about the EU's propaganda supply?
Well, a number of things, but what struck me, the more research I did on, because I previously published a report called Controlling the Narrative.
On free speech, really?
On free speech, yeah. And that was looking at the Digital Services Act, the Media Freedom Act, and a number of different pieces of legislation, which when you put them all together, demonstrated that there was something very systemic going on within the EU around speech, online speech in particular. And the more I looked at it, the more I realized that there was a consistency in the language that was being used. And when I actually sat back and thought for a minute, when you think about the concept of the Digital Services Act, it sounds, very kind of technocratic, very kind of neutral. This is where we're enforcing something which is like a utility.
Yeah.
So you kind of so you stop and think for a minute, and suddenly it hits you. Why are they using this language? Why are they using the concept of services when we're talking about free speech,
right,
which is a democratic right? It's not a commodity that gets served to you like your telephone package. Which package are you on? How many minutes are you allowed, etc. A month, data, whatever. And so you suddenly realize that the entire framework for conceptualizing speech, free speech in Europe has already been contained within this, what I might call this wrapper, with this language that they're using. And then it kind of struck me that, there's something that needs to be investigated here. How is it that they've managed to get away with this? It's a remarkable thing when you think about, that this is how we frame free speech. So it's not called the Digital Speech Act. It's not called the Digital Surveillance Act, but it's in effect, it is a surveillance and a speech act because it enables the EU Commission to decide what can or cannot be said, what can be published, etc. But it does it in such a disingenuous way because it's itself not directly doing it. It's forcing the social media companies to enact this. And more importantly, use their algorithms to find all this stuff, which is very interesting. I'll make those points in the report in passing that when it comes to artificial intelligence, we have the Artificial Intelligence Act, which ring fences everything about, what safety and what, all levels of different kinds of concerns and fears and everything about the use of algorithms. When it comes to policing speech, the EU are very happy to get all these companies and projects to develop AI systems that will automatically detect hate speech. And of course, it begs the question of who decides what's hate speech, who defines it, and therefore, whether this then just becomes, and this is just once again to go back to the services concept, it's a kind of, it's like this is like a contractual obligation. This is like the delivery of something. It's not about democratic rights.
Who knows the hearts of men? Who knows the heart of the EU? It's very difficult to say, but I would like to push you a bit and ask you, what do you think is behind this? Do you think it's motivated by concerns about false information, false medical information being out there? There was a lot of concern around COVID, wasn't there, around trying to control the narrative? Or are people concerned about, what kids? We're all concerned about what the kids are consuming online these days. The porn is not like the porn of yesterday. It's very, very explicit. And then you have people saying, I suppose, mean stuff to one another or worse on social platforms like Twitter. So is it concern about those things that's fueling all of this control? Or is it, do you think, something else?
Well, it's a very interesting question, though, because I've no doubt that there is a genuinely heartfelt need to control or to police, or not police, but concern about hateful speech. And there is hateful speech, but then again, who defines what hate speech is? Words do harm, an unwanted or an uncalled for, an unexpected goodbye can be very harmful, right? Not just, racist terms or, denigrating women or whatever. Those are hateful words. And so, so on one level, we get sucked into this because we think that there is, and there ought to be, some kind of not control, but mindfulness when it comes to the use of language and how we do it. But the question then is, how do you deal with it? The response from the Commission is that you've got to police it and you've got to, basically declare it illegal. Right? Yeah. You've got to legislate around this.
So where it leads them is to a very intolerant place and a very censorious place. Yeah. So the road to hell could be paved with good intentions.
Well, yes, on the one hand, but I'll come back to that because that's right what you're saying. But it doesn't naturally lead to the conclusion that that's what you need, because there's another way of dealing with hate speech, and that is to expose it. Mm-hmm. That is to counter it with good speech. In other words, not to make it illegal or ban it or whatever, but expose it and deal with it in an adult way, which is that they are words and that they contain ideas and meanings which are not, that should be subject to discussion, that should be open to debate. So free speech, making people more capable of engaging in that kind of speech possibly is a better way of dealing with it rather than outlawing it. And that's the route that they've gone down. But I would suggest that the reason why they've done that is, and this is where it becomes rather murky, but a lot clearer. If you look at the evolution of the hate speech laws and everything, where it really ramped up was after 2016, after the Brexit vote, after the first election of Donald Trump. That's when the Code of Conduct was brought in, 2016, which was the precursor to the Digital Services Act. And the reason for that was because there was a new narrative in town that, Brexit could not have been possible without there have been misinformation, that people were misled, they were lied to. And of course, this is where your point about the road to hell. I mean, I think they are on the road to hell precisely because they have such contempt for ordinary people and their ability to distinguish truth from lies and meaning, etc. They actually think that people in Europe, the demos, don't have the moral independence that they have or their experts have. And therefore they need to have this kind of guiding hand of their betters to tell them what to think and what's acceptable and what's not acceptable. And so that's where it becomes very, very authoritarian, because they think they know what's best for everybody. Whereas in a democracy, the demos, really, that's where the power should reside. And that's precisely what they're doing, is to rob the demos of that ability to do that, because they have this self-appointed I think, fear of the masses, because they're unpredictable. Free speech is unpredictable. The energy of speech, words do harm. Words have got power.
Yeah.
That's precisely why we would defend free speech, is because words can harm. And more often than not in history, words have harmed orthodoxies and have changed society for the better. They've challenged the church, have challenged the powers that be, and that enabled new ideas and thoughts to emerge and society to progress. And so, that's why we would defend free speech 100%, precisely because we recognize that words do harm. And it's the commission who understand that. And what they're concerned about is that the harm that's being done is to question the status quo, is to question their legitimacy. And this is really, I think, quite an important point, because when you analyze what I've done in this report, and we haven't got onto the detail of it yet, but just to make the point that, my research has uncovered something like almost 350 projects that the EU has been funding for close to 650 million euros that essentially are reinforcing the language of the narrative, that if disinformation and hate speech.
Did you find variety in these? So we're 650 million. That's a lot of taxpayer money funding 349 projects. That's, a small number of people getting a lot of money. Do they sort of go across the spectrum as the type of organizations that are receiving this money? What are they getting it for, and who's directing it?
Well, before I get into that detail, I can just make the point that this money that we've uncovered is the tip of the iceberg, because these projects we discovered through the EU funding and tenders portal, which is a database which is open to the public, and the Horizon project, the Corbus database. There are many other databases that we've not yet really gone into, like the Erasmus program, a number of other funding. There's also, if you look at all the EU definitions of hate speech, all the minority groups, whether it's race, religion, ethnic group, sexual identity, gender identity, whatever, all these groups that are the targets of hate speech, every one of them has like a strategic department within the EU. And God knows how many projects are being funded.
A gravy train for pet projects.
Not 100%.
And all with the intention of really controlling the narrative.
Yes, and this is the disingenuous thing. So just another example. If you go onto the funding portal, and you search for projects around mental health, I discovered there was 227 when I did the research. And when I started looking at these projects, I mean, some of them are genuinely mental health. But then suddenly you discover there's a project which is about for young Muslim kids. It's about social media and the mental effects of social media on the Muslim community or whatever. And you read the project detail, and suddenly you realize this has got very little to do with mental health. It's got, again, this is all about the narrative once again. It's the very same. Although it's not called hate speech and disinformation, it is about the
What would they be trying to control with that particular project?
Well, I think what they're trying to do is essentially train young Muslims into thinking in EU ways, i.e., what's acceptable, how to spot hate speech against their own community. I mean, you'd have to be a moron if you're a Muslim not to be able to detect when somebody's having a go at you. I mean, come on. You don't need the EU or anybody else to teach you that. You live with that. If you're black, in this country, you don't have to be given sensitivity training as to when people are being racist. You experience it every day, and you're immune to it, and you know how to deal with it. So what they're doing is a lot of these projects are about are focused on youth and so-called making people aware. It's not being making them aware of hate speech in order for them to be able to live in.
It's a nudge to get them to think in a certain way.
100%. To comply with the narrative. That's the important thing. That's the language. So now, if you go back to those projects, so I went through, and I went through all of them, And in the report, there's about 10 examples of the language that they use. And it's what it's Orwellian newspeak. I mean, I've coined that cute little phrase, NEU speak. So in newspeak, and it is NEU speech. It's the language that is now everybody goes along with. And it's very interesting. So if you look at these projects, they all begin with an assumption that if you were doing genuine research, you would question, which is, hate speech and disinformation is a rising phenomenon and represents a threat to democracy.
Yeah.
They don't explain why or how, but that's the starting assumption of the report, right? And this involves NGOs. It can involve lots of universities in this research, sometimes independent research companies, think tanks. I mean, we're talking about hundreds of organizations who are receiving this kind of money. And what's remarkable is that everything is framed in a way that you ought to, if you were a genuine researcher. I mean, research is something that you do when you don't know the answers to that you're open to discovering new things, new knowledge, things that might even challenge your assumptions, that might change the entire orientation. What's happening in these projects is not research. This is just tick box exercises that are going to prove the assumptions that are underlying it.
Yeah.
So this is not manufacturing research. This is manufacturing propaganda. And it raises a lot of deeper questions about the corrosion of civil society, the corrosion particularly of academia, of academic research. Really raises a fundamental question.
I attended a meeting about a year ago with a think tank downtown, and they had academics from various European countries, and it was about hate speech and disinformation. And they're like citing Brexit. They're like citing conservative wins, and they're like citing concerns about immigration. And I'm like, yeah, but where's the hate? And they're like, well, with these things, Brexit was disinformation. Everything about immigration. If you say I'm concerned about immigrants coming to the country undocumented, they say, oh, that's hate speech. So there wasn't actually, I couldn't find any hate speech in the room in the presentations from the academics. What I found them was presenting, as you have detailed in this report, they're really presenting the assumptions of the commission back at them to give them a sense of legitimacy, to give them a sense of what they don't have, the demos. What I want to ask you, though, was can regulating disinformation, like there is different disinformation out there, we wouldn't deny it for a minute, can that ever align with democratic principles? Can regulating disinformation, trying to deal with it, like if you think from a medical point of view, you don't want people going out and doing stupid stuff, when they read it on the internet. What can we do about those type of things?
Well, yeah, I think there is disinformation, but the way you deal with disinformation is by information, is by countering it, is by and it's not it's almost like when you think about it, these people are, apart from anything else, it's just sheer laziness. This kind of if we're really concerned about these things, then we should be vigilant, and we should be looking out for these things, and we should be countering it when we see it. We should be, then again, who defines what's disinformation? This is, I could give you numerous examples where governments have been putting out stuff during COVID, for example, which was disinformation.
Yeah, that's true.
So again, this becomes this very slippery slope about who decides, and therefore, for me, the only guarantee in all of this has got to be public opinion, has got to be public debate.
Do you think that the EU is targeting a particular political ideology under the guise of digital safety? Is this, in some part, about going after this rising populist movement in Europe that we've seen various electoral victories in France and Germany? Is that somewhat here?
Undoubtedly. I think that's the point. I was getting at, but I didn't make clearly enough, which is that after 2016 and the rise of is not just Brexit and Trump, but obviously the rise of populist movements across Europe, populist movements who are questioning, the untrammeled vision, the federal Europe, the end of borders, blah blah blah, all that stuff, which is a real threat to the bureaucrats, to the political elite of the EU, that they most definitely are out. My part of my report is not just about controlling what can be said, but delegitimizing alternative narratives. That's really, I'd say it's 50% of what they're doing is geared towards that. It's to isolate, is to just basically make it unacceptable that this can be, this should be discussed in polite society. Then, these ideas should just be ruled out. It's the kind of, the AFD, the Hungary, Orban, the populist moment, which we see the rising tide of, which is obviously a real threat to the status quo in Europe. They are most definitely these projects, and I mean some of them are very explicit. They will talk about the far right and populists. Most of the time they don't. They disguise what they're really trying to do, and this is the remarkable thing. I really urge anybody who's watching this to look at the examples that I go through. I haven't got time to go through them in detail here, but it's quite extraordinary how the language, it's almost like they're all singing off the same hymn sheet.
Yeah.
There's a template, but it's not like anybody's controlling it. And I found myself being drawn into these kind of like dark chambers. You go down these rabbit holes all the time. There's just because the EU are so good at hiding information in public.
Yeah.
That you could spend days and not come out, and then when you do come out, you can't remember how you got there. So you have to kind of retrace your steps and everything.
That's why you did the work on this report. You did the work for the people who are watching this podcast.
Yeah, well, it's the research. It is research, but the point is that when you start going down this and you start realizing that everybody's speaking the same language, and it's not an accident. It's because you have this kind of recursive loop where the language gets embedded, everybody adopts the language, and then produces a report that basically proves the project was right in the first place, and always ends on, and this is a recurring thing, the need for more research. There's no end.
Is there a danger, though, that this could backfire and it could actually fuel anti-EU sentiment? Is there a possibility that people are going to see through this? Like, I know myself that so many people, like if we take the news media, for example, so many people say to me, I don't watch that. I don't read that. And they go off and they find particular sources of information that they do trust. Is there a possibility that people will stop trusting and should stop trusting the actual EU?
Well, I think, most definitely, I really hope that when people read this report that they will mistrust them even more. This is not, as I said, this is not accidental. This is not, this is deliberate. And the more this kind of, let me step back a sec. So sorry. I think the key point here is that not many people are aware that this is going on. So, the fact that we've collated 349 projects, as I said, which is the tip of the iceberg, because there's lots of others that we've yet to uncover, means that, this has been going on for a decade, at least a decade. And it's not just that somebody's produced a report that no one's reading. Right, it's not like everybody's sitting around the dinner table in homes in Brussels discussing the latest NGO report on hate speech.
Yeah,
no one's doing that. what's happening is the language, the terms of the discussion are being set. It's not being questioned. And if you think about it, from the European Parliament through to the public discussion, the media discussion, they're all using the same language. They're all using the Digital Services Act, in this uncritical way. Everybody has adopted this. It's just become part of the furniture. It's like, and so this is the most insidious part of this. It just becomes, and we don't stop and think that the control over language is actually controlling what we think, what we give meaning to. More importantly, about what alternatives there might be. So, and this is what I think the Commission understands. I think they really understand that by controlling the language, you are controlling options, you are controlling alternatives, you are controlling thought.
Can government ever be involved in that? Should they ever be involved in it?
I think every government does, and every government probably ought to. But there's ways and means of doing that. There's a way of engaging the public. I mean, if you want to convince the public, you go out to the public and you have a public debate. You don't do it through subterfuge. You don't do it behind people's backs. You don't do it by funding projects with no oversight of taxpayers' money, etc. That it's not even accountable. The fact that we've uncovered this is probably the first time that this has been brought into the public light. But this is happening.
How does what's happening here, what you uncovered happening here in the European Union, how does that compare with what's happening in the UK or in the USA or in other democracies?
Oh, I think
is this happening all over?
It's happening all over. I mean, if you look at the Biden administration, I mean, I read a report just 2 days ago. It says something like $1.9 billion was used to fund similar kinds of projects. Again, it's kind of propaganda war that they've been engaged in. And what's interesting, and this is to come back to one of the questions you asked right early on. I think this is an expression of weakness. The fact that you have to artificially inflate this narrative, the fact that you have to artificially keep it going, it's quite interesting, isn't it? That here we have a commission that is committed to combating hate speech and disinformation and foreign intervention, blah, blah, blah. And they are so committed to this. But in fact, when you think about it, they are funding a network of organizations, NGOs, universities, etc., who are living off the fact that they are producing this narrative which proves that hate speech exists. So in other words, they depend upon this. It's not like they want to get rid of it.
Yeah. Does it have electoral? At the end of the day, is this going to have electoral impact? Like, for example, in Germany, the AfD were labeled as extremist. And like, once you begin to do that, like, they're an extreme. Are you going to vote for an extremist party? No, I don't want to vote for an extremist party. Like, the minute they begin to control language, it does have Orwellian consequences, and that's really at the heart of what you're saying.
100%, 100%. I mean, that if they do that in Germany, we've yet to see if they're going to go that far, but they could, and it would be justified in those terms. And because there's been this uncritical acceptance of the terms of this discussion, as if this is the only, when you actually examine the AfD and what they stand for, there's nothing that marks them out as being any different in respect to immigration or environmentalism or anything like that. Quite legitimate positions to hold, political positions.
Yep.
But they will outlaw them, and people are like sleeping. But I think it's very interesting that at the same time that they're doing all of this, despite all of this, we see the rise of populist parties.
Yeah.
When we see the media barrage against Trump in America, and despite that, the way he won that election, just shows you that ordinary people
can't see through the smoke screen.
Can see through it. They can see through it, and they've had enough. And they're basically saying, we don't trust your media. To hell with you. We believe what we believe, and we will have serious debates ourselves. As we, I know personally from the Brexit campaign, people took it really seriously. It's not like there was there were in the pub drinking, and then saw a bus go by which said, suburbs save the millions on the NHS or whatever. So, oh yes, I'm going to vote for, it's just like they were so cavalier about it. What's interesting is that ordinary people took this very seriously. What's really cavalier is the commission and the elites who've got this kind of very instrumental relationship to democracy, to freedom. The idea that you could contemplate outlawing a political party, the most popular political party in Germany, because you think they're extremists.
Dr. Norman Lewis, thank you very much for coming in and joining us today. And I'll just remind our viewers that in the notes below this podcast, you can read this report, and it's well worth your time. Manufacturing Misinformation. This makes the case that this is happening today in the EU. It's well worth your time to read. This is John O'Brien signing off for MCC Brussels. I'll see you on another edition of Deep Dives.